Thanks, Kathy. And hopefully you're seeing my screen there.
Oh, good.
Excellent. And so, yeah, do write those comments in. Kathy is, yes, behind the scenes, pulling the strings, as she says, but also reading your comments, your questions, and feeding those through to me. Otherwise, I'm going to pin the ears back and get stuck into some content. I want to talk about the engineering and design of raised crossings. I know there's been some questions that have come in to the earlier presenters who were talking a little bit. I suppose we started quite strategically and then it started to narrow down, and now we're into the details, and they palmed a few off to me. And as mentioned, my name's Ken Beer. I'm the principal engineer at Safe System Solutions, and you can get a PDF of these slides from the learning management system, and Kathy will show you a reminder at the end of how to do that if you need. But in there are my contact details. On the screen there, you see a QR code to my LinkedIn. I like to continue building capability, capacity in industry through putting out some content through that, and it's a great way to keep connected. The self-updating address book, I call it. So feel free to connect with me and we can continue the conversation. And of course, if there's anything that I mentioned that you want more details about or want to chat about further, shoot me an email or a message. Okay, so engineering and design, I'm going to talk about some key elements of engineering and design of raised crossings, but I'm going to talk at sort of a principles of design level. The reason for that is because we have attendees from quite a variety of jurisdictions from across Australia and New Zealand, and there are differences in the specifics of the way things are documented in design standards and guidelines and slightly different practices. But having a good knowledge of the principles is really important for that design decision making, and that should always be our objective as designers, to know where your standards and guidelines are, right? But know the principles so you can apply those principles at the particular locations. And sometimes you have to vary off the design standards and guidelines, but you make a justified decision to do that based on principles. And of course, you document it in design exception reports and the like. So understanding the fundamentals, the principles is what I want to get across today. I will point at different jurisdiction guidance standards documents sometimes to demonstrate those principles, or ones that I feel are really well presented, well documented, or easy to use that apply those principles. So if your jurisdiction doesn't have any information on it, you could use another jurisdictions as good justification. So what I want to get through today, and you can see there's quite a bit to get through here. I want to talk about ramp grades. How steep are we making those ramp grades in different locations? The signs and lines we use on the approach and at the raised crossing points. I want to talk about roundabouts and the positioning of raised crossings around roundabouts. Prue touched on this a bit. I want to delve into it a little bit more. I'll spend a fair bit of time talking about sight lines on the approach to raised crossings, both wombat crossings and raised share path crossings. I'll spend a fair bit of time on this because I think it is not well understood in industry. The principles are not well understood. And there's been some recent Austroads guideline changes, which I want to explain. And then I want to explain the principles again, so people understand that they may want to vary off Austroads. I'm encouraging that at the moment because I don't quite like where Austroads went, but I'll explain the principles of each. I'll talk about lighting and drainage. Now, because that's so much to cover in this short session, I will be touching on it at a fairly high level. Sometimes I'll delve into a bit of detail, but as I mentioned, I encourage that continual conversation. That's a nice, lovely picture of Warrnambool in Victoria there, if anybody's interested in where it is. They've done quite a number of raised crossings around roundabouts. I use them for a couple of examples. It's just beautiful down there. But let's talk about the design objectives. I want to talk about the objectives and principles of design of raised crossings. So HFER's covered this off fairly well, and Bridget and Prue built on it. But we want to create these crossings on pedestrian desire lines and cyclist desire lines to ensure the facilities serving the road users. We want them to be able to be used by all road users. Bridget passionately put that forward. We want to have high alignment with safe system principles. And I think that's been nicely covered. Fair's covered it well. And I mean, the nature of a raised crossing aligns beautifully with safe system principles for a number of reasons, which I'm not going to sort of go through in detail, but certainly slowing vehicles at these conflict points with vulnerable road users aligns beautifully with safe system principles. We've got to make sure we're doing that in a meaningful way. We want to consider them at a network level, ensure the corridor has consistency in these crossing treatments. But if we get into the design principles, this is where I think we maybe traditionally haven't had quite the right attitude to it. We have, but not as much as sometimes I'd like. You can see there the first principle I've got is around the severity of crash. And that's interesting, isn't it? So I'm assuming a crash is going to happen or something is going to go wrong. And we want to make sure the speeds for the vehicles at the conflict point are managed to within biomechanically tolerable levels. And we know that sort of 20 to 30 kilometers an hour if a pedestrian was to be struck. You know, the 30 is at the higher end of what speeds we would like if that crash happens, or I suppose I should say when that crash happens. So I'm thinking about speed immediately, speed of vehicles through there. And then, of course, the likelihood, which is what we've traditionally really focused a lot on. Have we got sight lines? Have we got good signage, which is conspicuous, clear, concise, comprehensible, credible, consistent, and compliant? That's the 7 C's of signs, I think. Is it 7? Yes. Good drainage, appropriate lighting, manage speed for vehicles. And sometimes we want to think about managing the speed for pedestrians and cyclists on the approach to the crossing point. That's going to link very heavily with sight lines in particular locations, but I will talk to that in detail. Okay, sight distance. Let's get you doing something straight away. I've got a little thumbs up, thumbs down wombat here at this crossing point, and I think you know the drill. You can either use the thumbs up little icon or the scared face one if you don't like it, or you could write it into the chat, good, bad. Now we can see here, what have we got? We've got a crossing point in Mackay, I think it is, which is actually not like this anymore. I was just up there the other day. And you can see pedestrian crossing, divided carriageway here. So we've got 2 lanes going in that direction. Okay. So most people, I think, Kathy, there are saying they're not entirely happy with it. There's some elements they might think are okay, but not entirely happy with it. Oh, I'm getting a couple of thumbs up. Okay. Well, we do have lighting there. It is a pedestrian crossing as such, but there's a few elements that I would like to see a bit better. There's no, as Matt said there beautifully, there's nothing to get vehicles to slow down at all at the point. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we've got this multiple lane threat, as Michael has said there. I mean, that is something that is always important to think about, and certainly as a road safety auditor, safe system assessor, it's something that increases the likelihood of crash. What are we talking about when we say multiple lane threat? Well, let me use this diagram as an example. You can see here we've got lots of lanes, or 3 lanes in each direction, and if a pedestrian crossing was to be put on these on this site, what we would see is that vehicle trailing has a dynamic visual obstruction, a sightline impediment that blocks a huge amount of the crossing. And what we'd see there is the vehicle coming along here, pedestrian maybe coming out here, they slam on the brakes, and this one will continue through because of that dynamic visual obstruction issue. That is why the Australian standard says you cannot put a pedestrian priority crossing on a multi-lane in the same direction road. That's why that is part of it. There's certainly quite a few of them out there in existence. And I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the issues with that. But what about this one? Okay, we still now have 2 lanes in each direction. So we've got a divided carriageway here, multiple lanes. It's a raised crossing this time, and it's got that little bit of, I suppose, separation. Thumbs up, thumbs down on this one. What are we seeing? I saw a few thumbs up. Oh, people are liking this. Oh, look at all those thumbs up. Fantastic. And I'm very much with you. I mean, there's always little tweaks and bits and pieces we can do to improve things. But in general, I'm quite happy with this idea. So we can have these. But why am I happy with it? Well, first of all, I'm happy with it because it slows vehicles down. And that's, remember, principle number 1 I was talking about. Make sure we've slowed vehicles down on that conflict point. But the second one is that splitter island refuge, essentially, in between 2 lanes in the same direction. It's a unique sort of way to do things. But what it does is, when you can see there, the truck has sort of slammed on the brakes and a vehicle coming up that way. If the truck was running in a lane directly the same as it, you can see the sight line change that it would create. So we've opened up those sight lines nicely. So it's essentially kind of like this, putting that island in there, and you can see there that you get that open sight line. So I sort of started with that particular one because there is a fair bit of interest out there in industry about this topic at the moment. I know there's some Australian standards work happening on thinking about that. I know some jurisdictions are coming up with their own guidance. But the principle there is to try to open up those sight lines. But slowing vehicles is going to help immeasurably in all of this. So if you do have multiple lane ones and you need to keep them, or you feel you want to keep them, you slow vehicles down on that approach. Okay, let's talk about a few parameters we need to use. And general parameters here we talk about with raised crossing design considerations associated with sight distances. We need to think about the height, the eye height, or the vision height of road users. And we tend to use a 1.07 height, which is somebody in a wheelchair. I mean, it's a very specific, height. I think it's 85th percentile of a person in a wheelchair height. But anyway, that's one interesting, important parameter. A 1.6 meter setback is a very important parameter as well. That's sort of what we talk about for a point where a pedestrian is approaching and having a look and standing ready to cross, either at a pedestrian priority crossing, like a wombat crossing, or even at a non-priority crossing, a refuge point. And then we want to factor in, at some points, a speed of person walking. And we use 1.2 meters a second there as the normal sort of walking pace. But I'll talk about where you might alter and vary that. So we are trying to, in an ideal world, meet approach sight distance. That means, can a vehicle approaching the crossing see the crossing, know it's there, have time to make their reactions and adjustments? Crossing sight distance, right? And this one is about the pedestrian here having enough time to see vehicles and to make it the distance across the crossing. And stopping sight distance, which is enough time for a vehicle to see a pedestrian back here that's going to cross. The pedestrian gets to there and they've got enough time to stop if the pedestrian crosses. Okay, so there's some parameters, and I'm going to talk you through this in a little bit of detail and explain those changes that Austroads has made. One common, I suppose, mistake that I would see, or a practice that I'm not entirely comfortable with, is that jurisdictions would just default to the road rules, which talks about a certain distance that parking cannot be on the approach to and the exit from a crossing point, a pedestrian priority crossing point. And okay, originally, I mean, this is in the road rules of Australia and the road code of New Zealand for the purpose of ensuring some sight lines are made available to the crossing, that we don't have cars parked right up to the crossing and blocking that sight lines. But to use this as your design parameter is inappropriate, because it is a very generic, okay, let's have some distance. And you can see 20 meters on the approach for this is the Australian road rules, the model road rules from there. And each jurisdiction's replicated the model road rules for these clauses. And you can see 6 meters there in New Zealand on the approach. So it's going to do something, but let's actually, as designers, calculate this and work out what is appropriate, because sometimes 20 meters for car parking is not going to be appropriate. Sometimes it's over killing it, like it's far too much distance. So we want to think about it from a case-by-case basis. So the first thing I was talking about there is approach sight distance. And a bit of a reminder, this is straight out of Austroads, and it's very run-of-the-mill. We use the same approach sight distance calculations for just normal intersections, but at a pedestrian crossing, we're thinking about, can that vehicle at driver eye height see, well, it's actually the top of the crossing point. But this is to make them aware. So as they're approaching, maybe they're coming around a curve, can they see the crossing in enough time to react and to slow down and to make their decision? Are they fully aware that the crossing is there? So it's approach sight distance. And that's definitely a parameter we want to be checking and making sure we've achieved that. So Austroads in the past had crossing sight distance only for non-priority crossings. So this is like a refuge island or something where the pedestrian has to be looking up the road and saying, okay, do I have a gap there? Do I have enough time to get across this distance? Because you can see that within crossing sight distance calculation, CSD, we're talking about the time it takes for a pedestrian to walk across that road. So it's looking up the road, finding the gap, and then moving across the road at that 1.2 meters a second that we talked about as the speed of the average sort of person walking across the road. Now, Austroads has added in there, in crossing sight distance, a 3-second sort of buffer startup time to get sort of moving. Now, that to me is a very good thing, and it makes a lot of sense on non-priority crossings. So if we did not have this crossing here, right, this pedestrian at 1.6 meter back should be, ensuring that they've got enough time, they can see that vehicle, get a little bit of time to get started, go across, and we've got a nice sight line there. It doesn't really make sense to have that as a for pedestrian priority crossings, because the distance we're crossing and the time it takes is somewhat irrelevant. Yes, we have to ensure that this vehicle can see that somebody is approaching to cross, to slow down. But once we're at that point, how slow they walk across and that distance is somewhat irrelevant. So that's why I'm not comfortable with crossing sight distance on priority crossings. I've certainly voiced that to Austroads and the authors, and I know some jurisdictions are not going to accept that alteration. But as it stands now, Part 4A in the Austroads Guide to Road Design does take this stance that you should meet crossing sight distance even on pedestrian priority crossings. So I'm telling you that as that's in there. Now, the thing is, people will often say, well, hang on, it's going to be safer, isn't it? And I say, yeah, it's going to be safer. It will be safer. Absolutely. You've got better sight. You're going to see this crossing from way further out. You're going to see the pedestrian crossing. And that's great. but that's at an individual level. What I believe this will do is hamper the ability of local governments, especially, to implement pedestrian priority crossings, because they will have car parking up to here, maybe, and they're going to have a huge amount of trouble removing car parking, as they always do, and the decision will be made, well, we can't quite achieve that. Now, I'll make the other argument even on this, is that, well, if you can't meet crossing sight distance at a non-priority crossing, you won't be able to meet it at a priority crossing either. It's got the same danger situation, but what you will be able to meet here is approach sight distance. Okay, so the driver themselves will be able to see that crossing, know that they could have to do something. So if you take it on a balancing out your risk scenario, it is actually better and more important to have that priority crossing than it is to have a non-priority crossing on a case-by-case basis. So I'm seeing lots of comments coming in, and so I've got them glancing them out of the corner of my eye, and most of them I'm sort of going to talk to as we tick along. I'm just sort of establishing, ensuring everybody's got an understanding of these different sight distance requirements and the like. So if we take a sort of 85th percentile speed, which we're going to need to understand the approach speed of vehicles to make some of some of these decisions, we want to ensure that we keep essentially that triangle free of obstacles that are going to block the sight lines for both the pedestrian and the driver in these situations. It's actually based on the pedestrian when it's CSD, crossing sight distance, but nonetheless, okay, that makes a slight difference in terms of eye height. But anyway, if we set that up 1.6 back and the like, we see there, we can just quickly run our numbers through, adding that 3-second buffer, which has now been included, and run that out to 141 meters. As at 50 kilometer per hour, 85th percentile flow speed of the vehicle. Okay, in practical reality, that is excessive in my opinion. But it's what you would get in an ideal world. You might be able to meet that. But this is talking about 85th percentile flow, non-raised crossing, just a zebra crossing. If we go ahead and raise that, okay, what are we sort of going to do? We know that vehicle is going to slow down, don't we? They're going to slow down regardless of whether they see a pedestrian or not. So immediately we get this benefit of understanding sightline alterations, that we know that vehicle not only is going to slow down, but they'll have their foot on the brake. Thus, our reaction time is down. So what we can sort of do there is say, well, the ramp grade speed. So that's essentially the design speed of the raised crossing point. And I'll talk to you about, what you can expect as a design speed with different angles of ramp. There, say that's a 25. So we've got it down to about that. So you're then able to say, well, okay, it's a 25 kilometer per hour, which we take as our 85th percentile sort of speed. And we run that sight triangle because it's raised, because that vehicle has slowed down. And then we can run that through, and we can see we can essentially halve the sight distance. Still a large sight distance. Obviously, my little diagram here to fit it on a slide is being compacted down, but nonetheless, it's a lot less there. But what we actually have here is an interesting phenomenon. I just want to talk to you about it from first principles. What we will see is that a vehicle will have their free flow operating speed, say it's 50 kilometers an hour. They're going to see the crossing. If we take approach sight distance, they see the crossing. Then they react. They pick the foot up and they start preparing themselves to have to do something. Then there's this sort of really important point here where the driver slows down. They start their slowing. Now they're slowing at this point, not because they've seen a pedestrian necessarily, but because they're going to have to navigate over what is essentially a speed hump. Right. Then there's a critical decision-making point by them, which is, am I now going to take the foot off the brake and put it back on the accelerator and continue over this? Or am I going to continue to brake and stop because I've seen a pedestrian? And that is your critical point to ensure sight distance, because they're making their absolute decision at that point. Do I continue on at this speed and then speed up, or do I come to a stop at the hold line? So you can get some significant gains in sightline improvements. But one big mistake I see people make all the time, and it impedes the application of raised pedestrian crossings, is even though this is a raised crossing, they take this, the 85th percentile free flow speed, and they run their sight distance calculations, which are far bigger than you're going to need them for, because you're slowing vehicles down using the raised platform. Now, this is probably at the lower end, and maybe think about something in between, but certainly that is very much well within your acceptable design justification for those sight distances. One thing I'm not quite comfortable with, but in absolute theory should work, but in practice doesn't, is that you could talk about minimum gap sight distance, which is for what you would use sometimes at a road where the vehicle doesn't have priority. And this is in theory the same. Like, this vehicle in theory should always come up to pretty much a stop to see whether there's somebody coming, and then continue on, right? And this is the sight distance on this would be next to nothing, but that's not how vehicles operate at a raised crossing. They use it more as a speed hump unless they have that activation to react accordingly. So I don't recommend using this one. It's just far too small. It doesn't, because of the way people operate over raised pedestrian crossings. Now, I'll pause there, Kathy. I've seen a lot of activity, which has been good. Lots of links seem to have gone in. Some links to actually some research, I think, that I'm going to be showing, which is about ramp grade. So thank you, Michael, for sharing that. I'll base a lot of the ramp grade discussion on that. I'm just checking, Kathy, is there anything I need to deal with, or do I keep moving forward?
No, Ken, I think Neil's question you answered about approach speed be considered lower because of a raised crossing. There were some questions around curb extensions and curb build-outs.
Well, that is just wonderful lead into.
Is that a segue?
It's just a beautiful segue. Usually I would ask people for ideas. And in fact, actually, I'll ask people for other ideas. So what if we can't meet this sight distance requirement? Well, people have said there, okay, curb build-outs, right? Let's open up sight lines that way. You can see there's going to be a difference. Obviously, these are very much mock-ups, but the general idea is there. If you need your 1.6 meter setback, well, why don't we move that all in? And that's a really good treatment. I always do, I suppose, talk to people about, sometimes you're squashing bikes in there as well. So if you can have a think about that, sometimes bike bypass, or make it a consideration. What else could be done here?
LATM on the approach, flashing lights, high friction surface on approaches.
Great. Yep. Okay. Oh, thinking lots of good ideas here. So high friction surface is a good one, considering when we're doing stopping sight distance calculations, which is another one you would want to be meeting. And that's actually what I would go through. You're thinking about the surface friction. You're thinking about, is this on a downhill grade, and those sort of things. So that would improve things. Flashing lights to give even further warning and help with approach sight distance. And local area traffic management on the approach is a really good idea, because we're starting to address this speed earlier on. And that can be really helpful in us, in us getting better sight lines. And yes, of course, opening up sight lines by removing parking or removing any obstacles within that would be ideal. But we find many, many scenarios out there where that just is something that hampers the project altogether. So,
Ken, just before you move on, if you've got time for another quick question, do you see, as in the speed effect on raised safety platforms that don't have crossings as well? So the reduction in approach speed.
Yeah, so I'll go back to that. I mean, essentially, if we don't have a crossing, so you've just got a raised platform or a speed hump, there is no, you take away that crossing bit and what you see is a down and then a back up. So they will slow down, you navigate over it and then speed back up.
Thanks.
So a lot more raised crossings and roundabouts, and this becomes a scenario where it's very interesting to think about sight lines because you're seeing these approaches. So sometimes you can't see that 1.6 metre setback pedestrian crossing at that location. You want to think about the speed the vehicles are actually navigating the roundabout, not the free flow operating speed on the approach to it. And so that might alter things. But really, again, I talk about having approach sight distance being, the fundamental there, because if you don't have crossing sight distance, the red line there, right? If you can't meet that one, if there's no pedestrian priority, okay, so you're making pedestrians pick their own gaps, that is a worse scenario. But we can meet the approach sight distance, the green. So it's like the design requirements have actually forced us into putting pedestrian priority crossings, raised crossings, anywhere we have, pedestrians crossing as it's their desire line, and we're creating curb, ramp downs and the like. It says it because we can at least meet one in this scenario, but we can't meet the other. I hope that makes sense. In practical reality, a lot of the time you're slowing vehicles using raised crossings on all approaches. So you get, vehicles nice and low on those approaches anyway. And of course, you are thinking about this vehicle coming through and not stopping when, they've got they see they're free and they sweep around. And so you are creating some speed here. You don't just assume that they all stop at the roundabout, because that, again, is a bit like that minimum gap sight distance that we were talking about. I think John, and hello, John. I think John's talking about often that the really great point and a very experienced point coming across there, that drivers are often looking out that way as they go around a roundabout for a vehicle that's coming in, because that's who they're going to have to give way to. So you've got to really ensure that your sight distance at approach sight distance is quite good there. And I'll talk about setback and how you do this, but again, the raising of that crossing is a pretty important thing. Making it raised really heightens the driver's alertness to that crossing point. Gee, great group. Lots of wonderful stuff coming in. Let's talk about this one. Here we go. A thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay. I think, was it Prue or Bridget talked a lot about, putting crossings so people can get off the bus and cross safely. And of course, they're going to need to, either get off the bus on one side of the road and cross back, or vice versa. They need to cross the road. I mean, you've got to cross the road to get on your bus. So we want to provide these crossing points. What about this one in particular here? You can see bus stops right there. You got a crossing point. I saw a couple of people a bit scared with the scaredy face coming in. Okay, good. Okay, everybody's starting to see on the same page. We've got what we call that dynamic visual obstruction again. So the posted speed's 50 kilometers per hour at this location. There's nothing to physically slow vehicles down. A lot of the day, there is really great sight distance to this crossing when there's no bus there. But when the bus is there, obviously it's bad. And in fact, it just happens that when the bus is there, there's a lot of crossing movements because people have all got off the bus and then they're crossing. So we actually introduce our sightline impediment at the same time we introduce the exposure of the pedestrians crossing. So I want you to absolutely take into account parking, be that bus stops or car parks, into your sight line impediments, even if you can sort of try to find a little clause somewhere that says it's not a permanent fixture. It is a sightline impediment, absolutely, and you can see it in that one. Okay.
And sorry, did you know what the posted speed is there on that one?
Yeah, I mentioned it was 50 kilometers per hour in this location. Let's have a look at this one, which is in a 40 kilometer per hour zone. Actually, this one, it's quite nice. But what are we thinking? Again, you like the look of this one? Yeah, see a couple of thumbs up coming in. Yeah, people are liking this. Well, we haven't switched. It doesn't look, the lights haven't been switched on, the flashing lights yet, but generally, yeah, pretty happy with what we've got here. It's a nicely designed crossing. It's very clear. It's very obvious. At night, you'll see it there. It's got nice curb outstands, good sight lines. There, you've got nice correct signage. Everything's looking pretty good on this. I like it, and had the pleasure of doing a post-opening audit on this one with a colleague. And interestingly, we came back to do our nighttime inspection, as you do. And unfortunately, people would park up right in that bit that we said earlier, the road rules say you can't park there. And in fact, common practice is you'd sign that as well, as they've well done there. They even put a little bit of line marking to indicate that. So very sort of well designed in accordance with the standard drawing in the Australian standard. But unfortunately, people still using that at some points as a bit of a parking spot. So you can think about a bit of curbing or the like here sometimes to reinforce that if you want. It is against the road rules and it should be enforced, and they shouldn't be doing that. But sometimes we have to understand sight and understand that people will break rules, and we can then design to try to make sure they don't. You've got to be a little bit careful with the ways that you do that. So bollards, I mean, in theory would stop that, but can potentially have some problems with vehicles getting in and out of the parking spot. So you need to think just about adjusting and do some swept paths on parking, just to make sure people could still get in and out wherever you've set your first car park back to. So that's a good one. And I'll come back and actually show you another couple of interesting features of this one and the one that's a bit further down the road on Yarra Boulevard in Richmond there in Victoria on that one. But, we're doing thumbs up, thumbs down just for the fun of it. Let's go. What do we see thinking thumbs up, thumbs down at this location? Now, it's hard to do thumbs up, thumbs down on this because you don't really see a lot of it. You're sort of seeing a little bit of the crossing there. I've seen lots of thumbs up. Well, I mean, I generally think about this. The one important thing you can't see is this is on the approach to a roundabout. There's a few little things. I mean, I think we're rife for the same problem of vehicles parking right up to here. So that's a bit of a challenge to deal with, but generally nicely raised crossing, good flush there. And the one interesting one I do want to also talk about is, what is the sort of height of signage and height of vegetation that you would be thinking, is appropriate? And this one is pretty hard to find anybody's well-documented rules or the like. But I think as David's put there, 0.5. So my rule of thumb is 0.5 to 1.5. Keep that clear. So 0.5 to 1.5. Keep your window clear there. That they're important ones. You certainly, some people do argue, no. The CSD requirements are 0.7 height, which is, remember I said earlier, the height of somebody in a wheelchair. Now, the consideration you need to take on that is not just about, that's about them, somebody in a wheelchair or a kid or, small adult being able to look over something to see out if a vehicle's coming, okay? But you also want to think about the vehicle coming. And if that's the case, they're only going to see just the little top of the head of the person in a wheelchair or the kid or the like. So it's really might meet your CSD requirements, but your your essentially safe intersection sight distance or your stopping sight distance wouldn't be met, because the thing that you've got to be aware of is hidden by shrubbery or signage or whatever it is. Now, I make this point because this area is so attractive to landscape gardeners. They love it. They love it. They want to put their sculptures in there. They want to put these lovely big flowering bushes, because it's prime real estate for landscaping. So you really do want to ensure, when you're doing road safety audits of these designs, or you're looking at designing them yourselves, that you keep that to low shrubbery, ground cover type vegetation, and you consider the signage. Again, it's like great spots sometimes for people to want to put welcome to whatever township or city center, big signs and the like, because it's really prime real estate for that. But we need to be fairly secure in making sure we don't block sight lines associated with that. Yeah, why not landscape on the departure side only? Fair question. I mean, in theory, that's absolutely right. We shouldn't be putting anything there. Low ground cover, I think, is acceptable and does really beautify an area and make it nice. It's a nice spot for some greenery and the like. So I'm not too worried about that. It's just when we get big shrubs, trees, sculptures, big tourist signs and the like. Yes, Neil is onto one. Yeah, and you often see the A-frame from the coffee shop just there get plonked out there because all the drivers see it. So we want to be a bit, we want to be conscious of that. So bit of low ground cover here. I mean, you can see there, they've done pretty well there. It's fairly low. You want to just make sure those species aren't going to be the ones that really grow up high. But the general ground cover can work really well. And you can see it is beautiful. Looks really, really nice for the town. One other little thing I like here, it's a little tip, is beautiful use of the disabled parking spot. So you have popped it there because you get your buffer area there for the doors and the unloading and the like. But it also means that when the vehicles back out, they don't back onto the crossing because they've got that distance, and you utilize that space well, as opposed to just not having anything there. So that's a nice, elegant bit of design work, in my opinion, in terms of where to put things and the like. I mean, it's not the end of the world, in my opinion, if somebody has to back out onto a crossing. I don't particularly like it, and I'd try to avoid it where I can. But it's not like we're talking high speed, and it's it's lower risk, but it's not desirable whatsoever. Buffer should be on the right. Yeah. So that's because that's where the the driver, if they are somebody in a wheelchair, gets out. Yes, it's a very good point. Don't have
Is that one a raised one, Ken, or just a?
Is that a raised crossing?
Yeah.
It's a raised crossing. Yeah.
Okay, great.
It's a fairly low mount raised crossing. I'll talk about that and heights of crossings and ramp grades and things. It is a very low speed environment in its entirety here. This is again warnable. The whole area is quite low speed. So yeah. How come there's no piano keys or signage? So there is piano keys on the approach side, and you can see it on the approach over there. Sorry, I just drew on it, so now you can't see it. The exit. So you don't need to piano key mark the exit ramp if you don't want to. It is about the approach there. And in terms of signage, again, you don't actually need to sign the raised nature of it unless you believe it's unclear that the that it is raised, or the proportional difference in approach speed versus the speed you expect them to navigate that ramp. There is some advanced warning on this. I'll show you the signage setup you'd be going for. All right. How are we going on time here? Okay, let's do a bit on this absolutely fascinating topic, which is the sight distances for shared path crossings or cycleway crossings. So we've got a shared path or a cycleway that crosses a road, and we want that path to have priority. So what we need to do is similar thinking to our pedestrian crossing one, and we do a couple of little differences. We've got the 1.4 meter as eye height generally for a bike. If you're on a cycleway, if it's on a shared path, you'd use the 1.07 that we talked about with the wheelchair person. What on earth do we use as this? We knew it was 1.2 meters a second for somebody walking. Do we just use that again? Well, no, because this thing going to be going faster than somebody walking. And what do we do for setback? Do we do 1.6 meters? Well, no, they're not sort of operating in anywhere near the same way. So we've got a couple of interesting ones coming in, but I'll point you at a few things. So a bit of research here that I like associated with, well, how fast do people cycle? And they've got some nice cycling speeds and on different grades and what we can expect. But if we use some of the TMR technical guidance, which I like this for a couple of reasons, we're talking around the 15 to 25 kilometre per hour mark as that cyclist speed that you might expect, 4.1 to 6.9 meters a second. As another little rule of thumb, which I'll take you through shortly, which tends to work pretty well, which is 20 kilometres per hour for shared paths and 30 kilometres per hour for dedicated cycleways. It seems to work pretty well. There's been some studies, again, done by Cameron Munro, which have looked a bit at that and that some sort of generally saying that's about right. E-bikes, very interesting one. I don't have data on that. It hasn't been factored into much of this in a comprehensive way in terms of what they're actually running at. Michael's put in a really good point around, okay, they should be limited on speed. Are they all limited on speed? Well, definitely not. They should be. Are we going to design for much higher associated with that? Well, we need to find an appropriate balance. So it's probably one for us to keep an eye on, see if we're going to make any alterations. But so I was doing 100. So the sightline triangles we'd need to create if we wanted to design for 100 would be very excessive. And I think David's one point there is good in the sense that we've got some amazing micromobility technology just emerging, and there's a whole lot of interesting stuff going on in that space. The NTC put out a pretty good document on e-scooters and micromobility and legislation and what should be done. But it had a bit on e-bikes, but it was more focused on those electric scooters and the like. But let me talk to you a little bit about just sort of standard practice as we do for shared path crossings and cycleway crossings as they are at the moment, taking into account sort of the bulk of people walking and cycling, the overwhelming majority, and then we will have a few outliers, and that presents us an issue, but we sort of design on a case-by-case basis. But if we take these parameters, now interestingly, you'll see there that I've got the yellow across the shared path crossing. This is a common one that's popping up around Australia, to use that yellow marking to indicate it's a shared path crossing. And then the signage here essentially makes this a road. So as in, this is a road where this road has priority. It happens to be a shared path. This road has priority over this road. So it's marked like an intersection with a give way sign. And it says also, you know, to pedestrians and cyclists as well. But think about it in that perspective. Now, why don't we just use zebra crossing marking? So make this a wombat crossing. Well, that is a sort of hangover from, well, I say a hangover. It is a result of the road rules that say you cannot ride your bike over a zebra crossing. Now, some jurisdictions have altered that, but most jurisdictions are still in that space. So that was one. Another little interesting, tricky one with someone coming out of Queensland, I actually like it, is that there's actually lower lighting requirements on these crossings than there are on raised pedestrian crossing, wombat crossings, and it makes it more financially viable to put these sorts of crossings in, more financially viable. It also negates some of the spillover lighting effect into local residents. So interesting way that practitioners and designers in the field are actually adapting to some of the overarching design requirements, which I'm not sure is the right way we should be going, but it will happen. But I'll talk more to that later. In some jurisdictions, we're seeing this multi crossing where we see the wombat crossing, the raised pedestrian crossing, with a dedicated bike lane on the raised area as well. So with these, you would be thinking about your sight lines and design parameters for the bike, okay? Because that's the faster vehicle, so it's going to be further set back. So yeah, have a think about that for the bike perspective. Okay, so riding along on your shared path, and you can see the white car come in there, and we've got a nice sight triangle where everybody was able to see each other. Let's play that again. So you're going to see riding along and run somewhere around the 20 kilometers per hour mark. There's the vehicle. You can see the point where sight lines were made, and that's how we essentially want to ensure that at that direct point in time, everybody has time to make their appropriate decisions. Now, this one, I'm going to go to Victorian guidance just to roll out the principles here that we're trying to achieve on these types of crossing points. I think this is a really good document. I think there's some conservatism in it, but I think it's generally a pretty good way to start your design thinking when you have that shared path or cycle priority crossing a road. So I've put that document into the learning management system with a whole lot of other documents, but you can get all of these freely online. So let me take you through the theory on this, and then I'll give you a little stretch break. So what you want to do is think about an actual, what we call a travel time a travel time, and it's based on the environment. So it's based on the safe intersection sight distance calculations we'd use for both cyclists and drivers. And so what we want to do is think about, okay, what scenario are we in? Are we in a high speed environment? Are we in a really low speed, constrained environment, or somewhere in between? And then you pick your appropriate travel time as such from that. So the theory here is, okay, we're approaching this crossing point either on the bike or in the blue car. And if we've got these sightline impediments, okay, the driver may enter that crossing point and the bike is coming along much faster than a pedestrian would. So if we open up a sightline triangle there, what we're trying to do is ensure one of two things. We want to either ensure that the car slows down because they've seen the bike and the bike continues through. That's the way that the road rules are telling us it all should be done. But in theory, we also sort of make this allowance that if that vehicle overshoots, that the bike is actually able to make that call and that judgment to make emergency evasive action and stop. Now, we also see a lot of shared paths now and cycleways appearing running parallel to major roads. It's because we've got that lovely road reserve to work with, and it's a great place to put your path. And then you've got all these intersecting side roads that come along, like you can see in this diagram. So we think about ensuring sight lines in these locations by thinking about that distance back the bike will be, the distance back the car will be to make informed decisions. And then you want to, ensure you have that vehicle can see that bike, that vehicle can see the conflict point, and that vehicle can see a bike coming from the other direction, assuming this is a two-way shared path. Okay, if it's a one-way cycle path, you don't need to do that last one, but you also want to make sure the vehicle at the turn point can see there, the vehicle at that turn point can see, that vehicle can see out there, and you can see what we've created is what we call the sight envelope, really, at these points where we're turning. And that all should be free of any substantial sightline impediments. You have some little challenges associated with dynamic visual obstruction, but that's how we go about thinking of it. Yeah, so similar to rail line sight distances and the like, absolutely. So that's one scenario. The other scenario, which I showed you earlier, is we're trying to, we've got that crossing, so it's at a right angle, essentially. Another common one we'd see, scenario 3 I've put up here, is where it's running parallel, but then it's making its turn. The shared path is making its turn on the cycleway. So you want to create that. You'd obviously also be thinking about that sight line, but that one's sort of coming in straight, but I wanted to do that different scenario. So how do we actually do this? So the number one step, select that travel time based on the environment, the speed environment, the operating environment for vehicles that you're in. Then you're going to want to work out then A, right? What's the distance back we should be putting the cyclist to start our sightline thinking? And you use essentially your safe intersection sight distance calculations, but there's a nice little table in that design document that you can use, which talks about distance A that we're talking about there, A down there. And it's based on which travel time you've selected. And then, as I talked about before, are you going to go with 30, which you would use very much for a cycleway, a dedicated cycleway? This is, riders moving through fast. Or are you down here for a shared path around that 20? Or is it even, you feel lower than that because speeds have been slowed down in one way or another through geometry or the like, or somewhere in between? And you can then select your appropriate distance for A, and you find that there. Then you're going to be thinking about B or C. And again, there's tables there for B and C that you can use. They're all based on the sort of 2.5 meters a second deceleration, flat terrain. But, you know, it's a nicely set out way to at least get a starting point in your sightline calculations for these shared path crossing points. So for example, there we've got, if we've selected a 3-second travel time because it's a fairly low speed environment, we've calculated A at 17 meters, C at 21 meters, and you can then draw your sight triangle and try and ensure that's clear as practical of hazards, and that gives us nice openings. TMR, just to finish this little bit off, TMR's got some really good guidance out there, and some interesting points around path to path sight lines and path to road sight lines, and Prue may have talked to you about this year, had some involvement in it. I think Michael, who's on this course, had some involvement in it as well. But an interesting desirable 4-meter setback, 2.5 meters in constrained circumstances, or 2 meters for pedestrian paths only. And pedestrian paths only 2 meters sounds is, you know, that's logical. You know, we talked about the 1.6, but 2 if you're coming in at that sort of arrangement because they're moving fast. The 1.6 meter setback really is often because you're taking it somebody walking along the footpath and then going to cross. But if you have a path coming in at that, they're going to be walking a bit faster. So the 2 meters is a logical way to go. And anyway, those are some, I suppose, practical Queensland examples. Others may, in different points, look to that as justification for not being able to meet some of the more onerous requirements of other jurisdictions and Austroads. And I think it's pretty sound stuff there, but I wanted to flag that if you're struggling to meet some of your sightline requirements. What do you think, Kathy? A little break now, and I'll put this up for people to ponder while they're filling up their coffees. What if we can't meet? We've calculated out these sightline requirements on the shared path crossing or the cycleway crossing. What if we can't meet those sightline requirements? So let's take 3.5 minutes, time to fill up a water, and we will come back into it. A little bit of discussion in there about possibly putting measures to slow the cyclist down. Interesting one. A little bit of discussion there about whether we're putting hazards in the path for the cyclist. Flashing lights on the approach to a railway level crossing. Yes, these are all options, and it's all about thinking back to, okay, well, what are the fundamentals of sight lines, and what can we work as variables on that? So some good ideas there. So we think about, okay, can we reduce the speed of the cars on the approach is our first sort of starting point, which changes that C or B, depending on the scenario, which is the distance back we're thinking about the car needing to be. Speed management then for the cyclist, potentially to reduce A. Now that can be in a variety of forms. I don't really recommend, as was said in there, obstacles in the cycleway or the shared path away to slow them down in terms of bollards or making them sort of go in through these areas where you have the cycle path priority. The more common ways are a chicane of some description. So changing the vertical alignment for, sorry, not the vertical alignment, the horizontal alignment for the cyclist. But then the other one is the vertical alignment, where we start to see the use of either rumble strips or shallow raised points for the cyclist on the approach at these points. You may also select a lower travel time. I mean, you're playing around with the selection there. And then if you're at this point where you're really struggling to be meeting any of this, you might question the suitability of the priority crossing at this location. Here's an example, I mean, of slowing vehicles on the approach to the crossing point. This one happened to be done a bit more for drainage type reasons than particularly that, but the theory is sound that you slow a vehicle on the approach, which really can assist in your sightline alterations. Of course, just raising the crossing itself does slow the vehicles down, back to our original sightline discussions. In some scenarios, and I suppose to me this is a bit end of the line sort of administrative controls, is the alteration to a stop sign at the location and where you haven't been able to quite meet these, but I'd prefer to have opened up the sightlines, slowed vehicles down, look for measures to slow cyclists down through some chicaning or the like, but that is something that has been used. Let's talk about positioning at roundabouts. I probably won't do this for long because there's only really two sort of positioning considerations in general for pedestrian crossing, raised pedestrian crossings, or really any pedestrian crossings, but I, of course, like raised pedestrian crossings at roundabouts. And the two options are to have the crossing essentially at the hold line, as you can see there in option 1, or option 2 is sort of that 5 to 8 meter setback of the crossing. Now, what we're seeing there in the diagram shows one, I suppose, potential benefit of having the setback, which is essentially that a car can be paused waiting for pedestrians to cross, and another vehicle can come in and still circulate and move through there. This one, you see if they're paused waiting, this vehicle can't move through and the like. Now, from a safety perspective, that one I don't particularly care. Like, it's not a safety issue as such. It's a vehicle sort of congestion management issue when you're looking at it just from that perspective. And there's certainly scenarios where, you've designated an area as high place value, pedestrianized area, and wouldn't be worried at all if cars had a real trouble getting through the area. That'd probably align very well with your strategic objectives. But where we do get a bit of a safety difference and a safety concern out of these is actually for the vehicles entering into the intersection. And if we've got so I've added them there, as you probably see. If you've got this right up to the hold line, the vehicles prop on the crossing because that's right where their hold line is. Now that creates some risk for pedestrians and then walking around them and getting caught up. And it's not ideal from the safety perspective. Whereas these ones have that area to prop. Sure, we're going to have some of them with a trailer or a service vehicle or a longer vehicle will prop over that. But the bulk of the time we're seeing the cars prop there, and then the car props there, and then the next one waits back there, and you get that clear sort of crossing line. So that is our preferred, but I do say preferred there. There will be scenarios where you really either don't want to do it because pedestrian desire line, it's very much sort of off pedestrian desire line. And, this one's not too bad, but, pedestrians don't like going off their desire line. These are very, much on pedestrian desire line, aren't they? But then also just physical sort of site constraints and the like might challenge you to be able to do it. So I'm not saying that this is like wrong and never do it. I'm just saying be aware of that. Be aware of that and try and see what you can do. So here's some examples of this sort of stuff. You can see that buffered area, which is quite nice. You'll have the vehicle sort of come up and navigate over this and prop here, and the crossing will remain clear, and this vehicle can come in here and keep out of the circulating carriageway. And here's sort of the other one where we see this is, quite a large roundabout in this urban area, big land space there. But you can see there the vehicles are sort of propped, blocking the circulating carriageway. But it also, if they were trying to go into the roundabout, they would potentially be propped on the crossing. Another little design thing, and it's really a design thing for anything raised on our network, is to try to ensure that it's perpendicular to the travel of a vehicle. This is just to minimize destabilization, especially for larger vehicles and motorcyclists as they navigate over the raised surface. So you can see there the perpendicular. That's nice. We want to create that. In this design, you can see here they're trying to raise a signalized crossing, and I'm all up for that. Pedestrian operated signal, raising those. That's a really nice safe system aligned treatment. We like that. You can see this one though right on that curve, and that's going to create a little bit of a challenge for heavy vehicles and motorcyclists, just because they're hitting that a little bit, and it'll rock and destabilize a larger vehicle potentially. So what do we think we could do maybe on this one? One option would be to say, well, we can't raise it, but we don't like going down that track because there's so many benefits to having it as a raised one. Anybody got any ideas on what we think, could be some design alterations?
Question, Ken, is do we need to think about the heavy vehicle hitting the ramp on both approaches?
Yes, heavy vehicles will go both ways. So you do want to think about that.
Mm-hmm. So taper the crossing, extend the platform, non-parallel, have the raised tables before the crossing on the straight.
This is all great stuff. Very good thinking. So I like the idea of there, and it was sort of mentioned in there, sort of splay it, try and not have it as directly, essentially the raised part as parallel. You've got the crossing point in there, and that's one option which will reduce the instability there. Certainly the other one, extended platforms, but I also saw some good ideas of slowing vehicles further up on the approach, even at some points maybe a textured surface, which is not going to be as effective as raised, but in some situations might be all that can be done.
Just a quick one, sorry, Ken, on this one, I'm not sure if you cover it. There was a question earlier about the maximum width of a raised crossing. Is there a maximum width?
There's suggested maximum width. I don't know that off the top of my head. I'll have to look that one up. Somebody might know in the group. Big
prize if you do. And just another one, where do the tables on slide, where are you at now? Slide 49, 57, 58 come from? Oh, that's way back.
That'll be these tables.
Yeah.
They are directly from the Victorian government's document. Oh my gosh, I'm going to go way back. This one.
Design principles for raised priority crossings. Yeah, which is in the learning management system. No dramas.
Yeah, which is like they're tables, but you can work those out yourself because they're safe intersection sight distance calculations. There. It's just making your life easier that there's a lookup table, but SISD calculations will come up with the same results.
Okay. Great, thank you. I like watching this in fast forward. That's good.
When you watch the recording and then press fast forward on the fast forwarding.
Oh, okay.
So you can see here bent out crossing points where cyclists will slow because of that bent out, but it's also got that. So you're improving sightline requirements because you're slowing cyclists down a little bit, but it's also got that little setback. So the vehicle that's turning in can prop out of the way of the road vehicles. So it's a good practice way to do it. Yeah, so that's a 60 km/h road there, Bolton Street in Eltham.
Looks like a wombat driving that car too, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. If we made people count wallies, which we don't, that'd be one to look out for. Let's talk about ramp grades, platform lengths, and the like. So the simplistic theory on ramp grades, the sharper the ramp grade, the more people are going to slow down. The first important thing to understand is that it's not that the ramp itself is a physical dampener that slows the people down. They don't hit it and slow down. No, they approach it, they see it, and they slow down accordingly. Okay, so that's important. But essentially, the flatter, shallower the ramp grade, the higher the speed we would be expecting vehicles to go through there. So a very, stock standard raised crossing will be a 3.6 meter and a 1.2 and 100 mil high. But I'm going to talk to a few different height, length, and ramp length parameters here. So let's talk to that stock standard one, run of the mill crossing there. So who can tell me with that 100 mil high, 1.2 meter or 1200 length, what's the grade of that? Oh, they're quick. Gee, they're quick. I don't know if we're giving out prizes in this course, Kathy, but that was prize-worthy quickness. So a 1 in 12 ramp grade. So it goes up 100 and it's 1200 long. So we talk about that is 1 in 12. That's how we talk about grades in our design and engineering. We don't talk about them as an angle as such. We talk about grades. It goes up this much over this distance. So one thing you do need to always factor in is the horizontal geometry of your road. So there's a very exaggerated scenario, but you can see it's going to be steeper because of that angle of the road. So those are design factors that need to be taken into account. Now, we had this pointed out before, but this is a really good foundational ramp grade speed calculator tool, CDM research tool, and it's in there. But what we know is that at these different ramp grades, you'll see different speeds. Now, people approach them and they go over them, and if there'll be no speed response if their operating speed is through within this area. This is about perfect. This is about what we want. We know they'll slow down. This is where we're starting to get possible vehicle damage, and they will bring themselves back down into that category. And of course, they'll bring themselves down into these categories. So what we can do with this is say, okay, we've got that 1 in 12, which we were looking at. And so we would expect then that sort of 25-ish speed that vehicles will find as their general operating through that crossing. If we flatten it out a bit, you see maybe down to a 1 in 16, we know that that'll be just a bit over 30 kilometers an hour, which is what they will find themselves in that comfortable territory to navigate over that crossing. We've got some higher speed stuff here, which is more used for raised intersections. And you can see different ramp grades associated with some of those. Now, to make your life a bit easier, I've grabbed all sorts of bits from all sorts of standards and jurisdictional documentation, because there's a lot going on in this space. So some good information in there. We see stuff from Austroads talking about different heights and lengths and the like. We can see Australian Standard has its 75 to 100, 1 in 12 to 1 in 20. And TMR's got some good guidance in there. Platform height desirable 100 to 150. 150 is high, like that is a high ramp, and I'll show you why that's high. I'd be interested to see any practical applications of 150 in Queensland if there have been any, but I would imagine that would be on a very local road environment where you wouldn't expect certainly buses or any, well, I mean, a stretch limo would basically get stuck on that. Or a low coach or the like. I'll show you some examples of that. But in, it theoretically could work as long as you've captured the vehicle types that are acceptable in that location. Then there's the NZTA, Waka Kotahi stuff in there as well. Everybody's generally in the same ballpark, and pointed you at that depending on your jurisdiction. But let me just again talk to you about the principles and the theory we've got here. We've got ways to alter off this stock standard crossing, and you can extend the length of your ramp, which will make it shallower. It could be higher, as we talked about, up to that 150, and then if you have short ramp length, you're going to get a very steep, very if people are going to go through, they're very, very slow in vehicles. And it will potentially cause some trouble. You might elongate your ramp length, or you might have lower, and 50 is very low, and 50 at that 1.2 will be a very, very shallow length. So what we're kind of worried about here, I mean, what we're trying to do is get the speed reduction, but you also need to factor in the vehicles that are going to be traveling through the area, ensure that they physically can get over your crossing. Nothing will end your raised crossing program quicker than installing crossings that vehicles cannot navigate over or get stuck on or scrape through every time. So here are the issue points. One, the front of the vehicle hitting the raised ramp. Two, the vehicle getting stuck on that point, or the back of their vehicle scraping as they've gone up. And that, I'm using a sedan here, but when you're starting to talk longer vehicles with big overhangs, though, that back end issue can be a problem. And then the drag down and scrape on the crossing itself again. You'll also get potentially one off the front, same thing. If you've been able to navigate up it, usually you're right there, but it could be a possibility. So what we need to understand is, what are the regulations around vehicles, vehicle clearance, and the axle distance? Because that is essentially going to dictate, if we know that we have really mandated really high clearance for all vehicles and short wheelbases, we're not, and low overhangs, we're not going to have issues. But we know that there are differences, and we have the vehicle standard rules and regulations, and New Zealand, as I understand, is very similar to this. And we know that we've got that requirement of 100 mil, 1 meter from the axle. And there's a few other bits and pieces associated with it. It's probably easier if I talk to buses, because they're often our problem vehicle. Or I say problem vehicle, they're the vehicle we've got to really consider in this design. Certainly we do have those lowered cars, but their short wheelbase is very helpful. The long wheelbase here causes us challenges often with buses. So you need to sort of know your buses a bit, and know what's to be expected. But let's look here. Let's have our bus come in, and looks like the same driver there, actually. Okay, so a general minimum you would find for any bus out there, and this is not likely to be your commercial or your your usual public transport bus. This will be more like a coach that gets anywhere near the general minimums. But 100 mil off the center there, 6% off X being the axle point. And you can see 100 mil off Y as well, and Z. So, we've got some immediate parameters that we understand about really our lowest possible bus. You've got different buses out there. These are Transport for New South Wales examples of wheelbases and clearance. And you can see the clearance of a standard length commuter bus. And this is fairly common around Australia. You got 190 clearance. So you're above what the absolute minimums would be. And you've got some better angles as well. And I've popped into the slides there a few of the different long rigid buses, articulated 18-meter buses, and so you can start to see some of the differences. But as we relate that to our ramp heights and angles and grades and those sort of things, you're sort of coming in there. This is where your 150 just like at a low coach bus, a 150 high it's just going to hit it. It's going to hit it straight off. And then ramping up there and going through again, it'll sit on top of it, depending on the length you have of the platform. Now, you'd use at least a 6-meter length on a popular bus route to be able to cater for those wheels up, which is again in a lot of the guidance documents. And then you're going to likely scrape on the back coming out. So really know your buses is an important thing. Know the different heights that you're going to have coming through, and understand, is it a public transport bus route? Is it just going to get the school bus coach occasionally coming in or the like? And you'll sort of be able to design accordingly. So here's a 100 meter, so 100 mil high, 1 in 15 ramp grade. Now, if this was a public transport bus route, you probably adjust that a little bit, but certainly for one that gets the occasional coach down there, it performs adequately. And the disadvantage you have if you make this a more shallow ramp grade or a lower platform is that for passenger vehicles, it loses its speed effect. So you do want to keep this, and these buses will adequately cater or be able to navigate this. On a more popular bus route here, sort of 75 mil, 1 in 20 ramp grade, that will have vehicles go through faster, but the buses will accommodate that really well. And for your frequent bus routes, this is not a bad option. And there's just an example of how you can have that longer length. So the bus has both wheels setting up on the platform at once. Now, here's one which is quite interesting, which is the 75 mil high, 1 in 27 ramp grade. So elongated length of ramp. Now, these speeds are going to be somewhere around the 55 km/h mark. And really, this is not doing much at all, if anything, for speed reduction from the physical thing. What will happen with the installation of this, and what really did happen in the installation of this, was it went in. Initially, people slowed. And then because the bulk of drivers on this are people that use it, use this route a lot, they know that it doesn't do anything and their speed goes back up to free flow operating speed. There is no slowing on the approach to this because it's not operating as a speed hump. So you want to consider that that if you're going too flat, and this is because of buses on this one, that they've gone quite flat, it really loses the advantage of any raised features. You get a little bit of advantage basically just from the piano keys and the sign and the like, but you really would want to go with more grade than that. So if you can't if you're having trouble, and it's usually either going to be drainage or your concerns from the bus companies or the like, which sometimes happens, that you're struggling to raise the crossing itself. The application of speed calming on the approach is good, and I really do think this is a pretty good option. It's not as good as a raised crossing. Why is it not as good as a raised crossing? Well, first of all, you have to do it twice. You have to do it there and there, as opposed to just raising one in the middle. Second of all, you lose some of the things Bridget talked to you a lot about, step-free, nice, clear crossing. The other one is, you get a bit of a better sight of pedestrians as if they're elevated up. So there's a few reasons, but from the perspective of slowing vehicles on the approach to a conflict point where people could be hit, this still does that job. And that's, that's good. So why is there a departure cushion? The departure cushion is simply there because in practice, we know that if we just put a cushion on this side, vehicles navigate around it. They just avoid the cushion. So you have to kind of double them up, which is annoying. But because you're spot on, like, why would we don't need to hamper that vehicle, but we do just to stop vehicles taking that shortcut route. I mean, this one is an example where it doesn't have it, and they've tried to go with a little bit of a curving center spike down there to try to alleviate that. But the reality in this scenario is that they still just go around it. So there's a good Queensland example. Prue sent me some lovely video footage of it, really working well. And as you can imagine, this is cheaper. This is not going to impact on drainage issues, which can be a concern. People talk about sometimes the durability of the spike down cushions. They do last a surprisingly long time, depending on where you're at. But you can do asphalt cut-in ones, and they're really wonderful treatment. So the principle, remember, we're just trying to do is slow vehicles on the approach and at the conflict point, and do it any way you possibly can. Raising is ideal, but if you're struggling to do that for one reason or another, consider these sorts of treatments. A couple of standard drawings of your cushion heights and widths. Of course, you can see there the dotted overlay of buses. And that's the whole point, is that the bus straddles the cushion, tires either side. The tighter wheelbase of the car means that they are subject to having to slow down to navigate over the cushion. That's sort of how they work. This is an interesting one from Western Australia. Many years ago, I can't even remember how many years ago, probably 15 to 18 years ago, speed cushions on the approach to a multi-lane signalised crossing. And it's really sort of a wonderful example there of us thinking about, well, even though we've got the red lights, some people are going to overshoot this and run through it, and we should be slowing them on the approach to this. Another little thing to think about just on ramp grades and keep in mind is that you don't necessarily need to have the same ramp grade in and out. And certainly you can see this example from New Zealand where you're seeing a sharper ramp grade in than a ramp grade going out. And that can be a nice way to cater for some of the geometric challenges of slopes and the like, but also ease, the transition back in for a vehicle. The reality is we just need to slow them here, and then, they can speed up however they want out of that. Yeah, it is a bit of a poor sort of color treatment choice. I do talk a little bit to people about that. If you use these light concretes, then your zebra crossing marking can fade away. How are we going on time here? Okay, I'm going to run a little bit short on time, but that's okay. I'll zip through a few things at the end, and you can get in contact if you want more info. Just an example here, real world example of a fairly steep road coming down, and the attempt at a raised crossing under its sort of same ramp grade in and out. You see a really sort of challenging scenario of that transition from the downhill slope sort of there. And it's going to be awkward, very exaggerated diagram, but it's just to illustrate the point. You see the bus again coming out of that is just going to nose itself out, and then it'll get stuck on the top of it if it sits in. Now, this one, they're trying to keep the path fairly much flat there in order for wheelchairs and the like not to have this very awkward angle as they're crossing. So you can move that a bit, and there's some good documented stuff about the maximum sort of amount you can angle that. It's different for asphalt compared to concrete, actually, but and then you can sort of extend exit ramp grades. You can play around with that to get something that you're quite comfortable with. You can have a reasonably sharp approach there, and the vehicles can sort of navigate over it both ways. So again, I mean, don't abandon all hope of having raised treatments on when you do have these downhill areas, but take them into consideration in your in your design there. And you can see this one sort of has that now, some sort of ramp grade there, but a really long taper out almost down to the road there to really flatly get them to come down slowly. Kathy, any questions? What am I missing here? I've sort of got it in the corner of my eye, but
no, you're doing well. I've got a couple of questions if you want to have a change of pace with some questions throughout. Sure. Yeah, okay, great. So some of the questions that have come through throughout has been, one of them is, will mid-block crossings typically have higher vehicle approach speeds than crossings on side streets that require a turn?
They will, yep, that's right. And certainly when you're doing, I mean, so there's generally people don't want to put raised crossings on roads with, say, a 60 km/h speed limit. I'm kind of okay with it. You do some traffic calming around it and the like. But I think a good example there is where people will say, okay, even though mid-block 60 km/h speed limit and operating speed up there, the approach to a roundabout, for example, you would be very willing to put a raised crossing in there because you know their operating speeds are going to come down. Similar theory on the approach to intersections. You know they're going to be slowing down, and you're sort of factoring that into your considerations about what you're really talking about are design speeds. Thanks, Kathy.
Ken, yeah, no, another one. We've covered this a little bit around colour. I guess this is a comment, but looking for maybe some of your comments. I'd like to see the use of colour on crossings to better distinguish them for the drivers from a wide range of other markings on the roads. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I've got a picture later on around so use of red crossings, but then we do have a lot of discussion around visually impaired people and people being able to see that contrast. So the guidance and what a lot of the vision impaired consultants really advocate for is that black on white contrast being the best. I can understand some of that desire to really highlight it as opposed. I think a well designed, correctly signed and marked crossing does stand out well, but yeah, it's a legitimate thing to think about.
Terrific. I'll do two more if we can. Are dedicated left turn lanes recommended on higher speed roads to mitigate rear end crash risk?
Yes. Yeah, they help certainly in the rear end crash risk. They can sometimes present a masking dynamic visual obstruction issue where you have the left turner blocking the sight lines of the vehicle exiting. So you've got to be cautious of that. Certainly the TMR road safety advice around that is some specific offsets, as does the new Austroads guidance, which has an offset marking arrangement. But yeah, certainly reduction in rear end crashes. Yes, you will get that. And for higher speed roads, it is it's recognised as a good safety treatment from that perspective.
Okay, well, there's another comment that's come in about having colouring on the road before the crossing.
Yeah. I don't know of research around that. I'm always cautious of something like that. I want to say it sounds like a good idea. I don't know research around it. I can't put my finger on anything specific on that. So I can't really talk to it as good or bad. I know, we do see that in New South Wales a lot with school speed zone markings and on-road markings. They love marking the road up in New South Wales. And other jurisdictions aren't as active in that space for a number of reasons.
Watch this space. Beautiful. Thank you, Ken. Yeah.
We can't talk with enough certainty around that exact point. Maybe I'll do a bit of research on it, so next time I can. Right. A few more from me, and then Kathy will show you how to finish off the course in the learning management system. Lighting. There's a huge amount that could be talked about in lighting, but again, I'm just going to go with a couple of principles for you. Lighting can be a real hampering thing for the installation of raised crossings or any crossings for that matter. And again, my personal opinion is we have over requirements on lighting. Now, you can always argue more lighting is safer, but where I always come to is saying, well, is excessive lighting requirements causing us not to put crossings in? And the answer on that in Australia, at least, is yes. And I think we need to do something about it. Two aspects to that. One is the cost of lighting. And the second one I mentioned earlier is the spillover of lighting into local residents. And if you light these things up like a Christmas tree in accordance with the Australian standard, there's so much light that it really can be something that people heavily object to. The theory on lighting, and you see Australia and New Zealand Standard 1158 talks about this, lighting of pedestrian crossings, doesn't differentiate between a pedestrian crossing like a zebra crossing and a wombat crossing, a raised pedestrian crossing. So that's one thing of interest immediately, in my opinion, because we know one's a safer crossing point, we're going to get lower speeds. Admittedly, you have a raised area in the road in one of them that needs to be lit and to ensure people know that they're going to have to navigate over something. But in comparison between one where, you've got pedestrians out there without any slowing devices and one where you do, you're in a safer scenario with the raised treatment. But the idea is that you would light the pedestrian in both the horizontal and vertical plane. 18 points of interest for light for your lighting. And this diagram is out of the Australian standard. I think describes what we're trying to achieve fairly well. Each of those points, you're trying to ensure you have your lighting requirement. The lighting requirement's actually for a couple of reasons. One is to certainly make a vehicle aware that there is somebody on the crossing or approaching the crossing. Remember, approaching the crossing as well with our setback. The other is actually associated with lighting the pedestrians themselves, and it's more of a personal safety consideration that you want to light the face of other people so they can see who's coming at them from the crossing. That's the theory behind it anyway. I'll let you decide whether you think that's worthy use of lighting and the requirements. But where we end up finding ourselves in is under the Australian standard is really very, very well lit crossings. Again, we've got some jurisdictions that slightly deviate away from that under different scenarios. There's no real commentary out of the Victorian one around specifics on lighting for shared path crossings, but the principle would be to ensure that lighting, when we do those calculations of sightline back, that you're able to light the distance from there in A. You don't really care about C as much, to ensure that there's good lighting back at C here, because the car's obviously got very good headlights and the bike will see them, but the car really needs to see the bike. And you've got similar there with TMR putting about a 10-meter setback on where they want the lighting on the approach. And I think those are sort of more reasonable ways to start to think about it from that perspective. I think the lux levels required need some looking into, but at the moment you refer to your Australian standard. A couple of slides on drainage just to round this out. I think I've got a couple on signs. I've really boiled this down to 6 different ways that you can attack drainage, and I crossed one out. I'm going to go with 5 different ways you can attack drainage. I put this first one in almost as a bit of fun because I saw it again out doing a road safety audit where they just kept the curb and channel and made people step over and onto the raised crossing. Not good for a whole lot of accessibility reasons and the like. So let's cross that one out. Okay, you can go low ramp height to move your water over it, essentially. You can position your crossing at a high point. Now, you're balancing off there because if it's not on pedestrian desire line, there's no point having a crossing. But if you happen to be able to do all of that nicely, that water can flow either way, you're in a winning position. Then you can curb down and back up, and you want to transition that over a distance in order for people on gophers and wheelchairs and the like to be able to navigate over that. And you keep your curb and channel there. Box drains, and then of course the pit and pipe, so get the water down and go through. So pit and pipe, you do that, you may need to increase capacity there, and you've got some challenges in your major storm events and the like. The box drains are really good. They're a cheaper way to do it, and they can work really well, but immediately you're going to have to really concentrate on that from a maintenance perspective, a leaf litter perspective. You can see some examples there where you lay that plate over. Lots of them out there and they operate really well and they're fine. But again, if we go back to that one where my colleague and I were out there auditing, this had only been open for a week or so, and it's pretty much completely blocked from that leaf litter perspective. So think of those challenges. Some interesting tweaks. I mean, we talked about that little pocket of land the landscapers love. Well, it actually can nicely work as a little area to take some water, a little basin there, and it's almost like a little water-sensitive urban design opportunity in that space, something to play around with. We talked about this one again. Much cheaper way to go, but you need to have a bit of distance, and you can't have too sharp a grade coming in, otherwise it just doesn't work. So you can see a few of them out there. I've got pictures in there you can refer back to. That one I dare say is too steep, coming off footpath level down. Your gophers, mobility scooters and the like are just going to get stuck at that location. An example here where, I pondered this for a long time out there. There's a very low cost way to get that in, apart from the flashing lights and the lighting, but leaving that. But this, watch this lady slowly navigate up and down it. I thought, geez, you probably get another another couple of these raised crossings in for the cost it would take to put pit and pipe drainage through there. Is that worth it? And I don't have a call on it. If you can get nice flush crossings, that's going to be better, but we want lots of crossings out there. Last couple of minutes, signs and lines. I don't need to spend long on this because for the Australians, 1742.10 has a great, there's a really good diagram actually from Main Roads Western Australia that shows how that lays out, and it's pretty great. And you just sort of follow that. It works really well. Think about your height there. Think about if you don't have great vision to the crossing, you do advanced warning signs of the crossing, and people get really angry at this. Two regulatory signs on a post. I don't really care. It's such a low speed environment and everything's good, but theoretically they should be on their own post. I think we got way too many signs out there. We put out a note with a concept on at least some thinking around, can we start consolidating some of these signs? It's getting out of control. New Zealand, there's the link in your notes to where you get the signage. They use a different scheme with not the piano key markings, but the triangles and the optional triangle, whatever that thing is, diamond on the approach as an extra warning, and some slightly different setups for these crossings. And I'm running out of time, aren't I? We talked about making this like a road intersection, using a giveaway sign. A couple of references for you. There's the red crossing. As I say, generally, a lot of the vision impaired community have come out and said they do not like this. This is not good. Black or very dark color with white color in good contrast is the requirement. Yeah, here you can start to see where we're getting signs, just lots of signs, isn't it, for a crossing, which is becoming a bit too much, but I've got to keep moving on. Oh, gee. Pavement, just remember to box out so you get your nose and a nice your ramp grade there. Otherwise, it'll chip away, or you won't get a clean step up there. That's probably one. And then concrete is going to last longer, but you've got that light issue. It's easier to get your sharp angle on it. It's going to cost more and it takes longer to install though. I better stop, Kathy. You've got 2 minutes. Show them how to finish the course and I'll have a read of any questions. I may have to get back to some people.
Yes, I think so. You do that. Thank you. Okay, so just very quickly. Okay, so here we are in the July module and just wanted to alert you to some resources. We've popped in, Michael provided a whole heap of resources. So there's a document in there with a bunch of links. So that's there along with many other resources. And particularly for today's session, there's the road design and engineering resources in there. So lots of things that Ken referred to are in that bit there. But to finish the program, what you need to do is jump into this module here. You've got a quiz, multiple choice style quiz, so not very long at all. Do that one. Make sure you get at least 8 out of 10. Give us some course feedback. So jump in here and complete the questions there. There's not too many at all. And then a electronic version of your certificate will appear here and it won't be restricted anymore. And that's the end of the course.
Open up your envelope and wear your little wombat badge for a wombat crossing with pride because you've finished the course. Well, do that once you've finished your quiz and passed and got your certificate. But
It's okay. We won't know. We won't
I
know.
love wombats. Put as many in as you can, and get in contact if you need help getting them in, because we'll fight for more safe crossing points for pedestrians and cyclists.
Thank you, Ken. Lots to think about, lots to consider. Love your work, everyone.
Awesome. Have a good
Bye.
one.